It's the week ending Saturday, the 5th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen another rise in rail fares, this time by over 3%, the London Mayor trolling the British government via the medium of fireworks, and China becoming the first country to land a probe on the dark side of the moon. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining us today from the week's digital team are Holly Clements, Holden Frith, and from the week Junior, Felicity Capon. Happy New Year, folks.
Happy New Year.
And we've got really a trio of very cheery subjects to kick off 2019. And starting this week, it's Holly. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this a nail in the coffin for traditional burials?
When someone dies, their body is taken to a human composting facility. After wrapping the deceased in a simple shroud, friends and family carry the body to the top of the core, which contains the natural decomposition system. During a laying-in ceremony, they gently place the body into the core and cover it with wood chips. This begins the gentle transformation from human to soil. Over the next few weeks, microbes and bacteria break down carbon and protein to create a new substance, a rich earthy soil. This soil can then be used to grow new life. Eventually, you could be a lemon tree.
Happy New Year! A little glimpse there into the future of death, at least according to Katrina Spade's TED Talk. You can find that and more talks at TED.com. Holly, long-term listeners will note we do like to talk about funerals on this show, so we are starting the year in the house style. But what is the story this time?
So Washington looks set to become the first state to legalise human composting. Mm-hmm. It sounds a bit like something a serial killer would do, but it's actually being promoted as a way to return bodies to nature and nourish the soil after we die. Katrina Spade, who you heard in the clip, wants to revolutionise the way that we treat our dead. And a Democratic senator is backing her, planning to introduce a bill that expands the options for disposing of human remains.
And why does burial or cremation, the most popular ways to be disposed of in the United States, why does that need revolutionising?
So environmentally, it's not that great. In the US, 90,000...
Burial?
Yeah, 90,000 tonnes of steel is buried underground in the US, which is apparently enough to construct a Golden Gate Bridge.
So is that to do with digging the trench, or is that to do with the coffins, or
it's
both?
The coffins, and there's also 750,000 gallons of embalming fluid, concrete, all other kind of materials, and human leakage,
okay.
Which is apparently not very good for the soil.
I can imagine that human composting doesn't require concrete, but are you saying it doesn't require embalming either then? So the body's just left, is it?
Well, it's a special kind of process that she was describing where they use wood chips and other things over 30 days, so the body is kind of sped up the process of composting, but without the coffin. And then that soil is put into the ground. So you could be given a big bag of soil, which is your loved one, and you can spread it over your rose bush.
Felicity, are you sold on the idea of being spread across your rose bush?
Yeah, 100%.
You really?
Yeah, really up for this. I think it makes sense that if you're dying and the end is near, that everyone starts thinking about the impact, I suppose, they've made on the world, maybe. And, you know, things like deathbed confessionals and last-minute conversions to some sort of religion, it makes sense that you kind of want to do something where you've had an environmental impact. And there was a really funny quote at the bottom of the article that Holly posted. Someone said, "A very good and sensible idea. In some cases, it will be the first time they have made themselves useful." And I quite like that.
Holden, history man, how new is this service? Because coffins are quite a modern idea compared to just being chucked in the ground, aren't they?
They are, and cremation is actually relatively modern. I think it was the late 19th century that was first used in the UK. It had been illegal up until then.
But Indians have been doing it forever, right?
Yes, it's more natural in some places than others. But the idea of composting humans is also a natural feature of some cultures. I think in East Asia, there's a practice of leaving bodies out to be sort of pecked at by birds, and then the remains sort of kind of left and become a food for other animals. I sort of was sympathetic to the idea, as Felicity was to begin with, but the more I looked into the process itself, the less I liked about it.
Oh, excellent. I was prepared for this to get more grim. Let's go.
Look, I think it's presented as this very natural process. You kind of return to the earth, but The proposed facility in Seattle would involve putting 60 bodies at a time into a 3-story tall decomposition block. It would then take 4 weeks for this to turn into a sort of soil-like mulch. And you would get a bag at the end, but it wouldn't be your loved one. It would be a mix of all of those 60 people.
Ooh.
I mean, it's slightly...
Better not to give you the bag at all,
yeah,
I would say.
I feel that it's a squeamishness, but that really did put me off.
What's the squeamish bit for you? Is it the fact that your relatives wouldn't get just Holden, or is it that your body is left for 4 weeks before it decomposes?
No, I think the decomposition I'm fine with.
Yeah, because that happens underground anyway.
Yes, although actually that is one of the environmental problems, is because people are buried 6 feet under, there's no oxygen down there, and so the decomposition process releases methane, which is one of the most serious greenhouse gases. Whereas this process, because you're composted with access to oxygen, you decompose in a different and less environmentally damaging way. But what troubled me about it is actually it's the sort of industrialization, I think, the idea that you're put into this plant that then decomposes you. When we were talking about funerals, I don't know, 6 months ago, I was talking then about the kind of some of the reasons I hadn't found funerals to be satisfying was that kind of industrialization of death and the impersonality. And I feel that this is an attempt to alleviate that.
So Felicity, have you changed your mind now you've heard Holden's view?
I see his point of view, but
you're quite comfortable being stacked body upon body and
I hadn't actually realised
your bits being returned to your relatives along with 59 other people's?
Well, I mean, you have that with cemeteries anyway these days, I would say, because they're now so packed to the brim of tombstones that a lot of them are getting pushed up against busy roads, and they're in, hundreds of years ago, the cemeteries, you could have just had them in your backyard and it'd been lovely and nice. But
you
now
still
I
can
feel
get buried in your back garden with the right permission.
Yeah, it's true. But I think if you do want to get buried, a lot of the time it is going to be in a cemetery packed up against lots of other people. And I don't know, I feel I'd have the same kind of squeamishness about that too, in a way. I just like the idea of being returned to the soil. I think it's a really nice
I'm going to say I like the idea, but
like
the thing about being stacked one upon another is kind of, it feels a bit like, it's almost like an image of a concentration camp, isn't it? That's what you think about those pyres of dead bodies. That's what it feels like. Whereas I guess the whole point of cremation and burial, the processes around that, Olly, is that it's kind of done for the surviving relatives, isn't it? It's supposed to give the dead body some dignity that avoids some of that.
I would have said the opposite with cremation. I imagine lots of people had similar doubts when that first came around, and that the idea of putting your loved one into a fire is probably a horrible concept. I mean, it still is for lots of people. I think it's probably just quite a new age idea that we need to get our heads around. But also it's more of a cultural problem as well, I think, for us, because we're so set in our ways about the way we do funerals, and people think that they have to have the best coffins and the best caskets. And I think if you don't do that, you feel like you're maybe letting someone down because that's what everybody else is doing. So you need the first few people to go forward and do those things, and maybe once it becomes more normal, we wouldn't be so squeamish about it. I think that's quite an ingrained
Holden,
feeling.
Maybe your squeamishness is because we don't talk about death enough.
Well, we're doing our bit for it. It could be. There are two other alternatives put forward as green means of disposing of bodies. One sounds even more horrific. The other I like.
Is it soil and green?
It's a bit like that. It's called alkaline hydrolysis, and you put the body into a pressurized container that looks a bit like a CAT scanner with an alkaline solution and water, and you raise it to temperature of 150 degrees centigrade, and after 20 minutes you're left with bones which you can grind up, do what you will with, and then a liquid which you can apparently just drain away into sewers. This is used in the US, Canada, and Australia.
This is a really good tip on how to dispose of a body.
Yes.
Bill and Killing Eve is taking notes as we speak.
I am worried about my Google search history. But so this is allowed in the US, Canada, and Australia. So far, it has not been allowed here. And there was a brilliant quote from the UK Water Authority explaining what the problem was to the Sunday Times. He said, "It's the liquefied remains of the dead going into the water system. We don't think the public will like the idea." But the alternative I do like, and in all seriousness, I think I may well change my will to this, is natural burial. You are buried, but you're not buried in a coffin, or it's a more biodegradable form of coffin.
It's cardboard box,
and
basically.
you're buried in a more shallow grave, and you just decompose naturally, not as quickly as in this composting method, but you are exposed to oxygen. You
mitigate some of the environmental concerns of coffins, basically.
Yes, but you can return to the natural cycle as you would, before the whole kind of funeral complex became a part of our lives.
I mean, it might be that there is a growing awareness of environmental footprint, and that is behind Washington State trying to legalise this, but it's not as simple as that, is it, Holly? Because it's also about the economy of the thing, isn't it? These funerals are going to be $2,000 cheaper than traditional alternatives, and we've seen this growth in America of people crowdfunding funerals. People can't afford them.
Yeah, it is one of the saddest things how much funerals cost. I think you don't want to leave the world and leave your loved ones worse off just because your funerals... I sound like an advert, don't I? I sound like a funeral insurance advert. But no, that definitely factors into it, that they've managed to make it a cheaper option. And I like Holden's idea, if we're all discussing how we're all going to go, but the green burial idea, I think, is where Katrina Spade started. But she's trying to do it for cities, so it's Seattle. She's Seattle-based, so there's not that much land space. This is kind of a smaller version for cities, and intense in a building, getting decomposed. I know it does sound a little bit crazy, but I think it could be the way of the future.
And that's why it's your story of the week. You really do think that they will greenlight this and it will start happening?
Yeah.
Okay, Felicity, you're up next. You're still alive.
Yeah.
We will hear your story of the week after this. Right, Felicity, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
If you want to make your voice heard in 2019, you better head to the streets.
France's yellow vests have inspired similar protests across the continent. They've spread to Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, and even the UK. The yellow vests share many grievances with demonstrators in other countries, but not necessarily the same goals. These movements have no clear leadership structure. They're propelled by social media, and they often get out of control.
That was a report from The Telegraph back in December, in which we took a tour of Europe to see men in high-vis jackets throwing things. Felicity, it's catching on this, isn't it? It's the Gilets jaunes?
Yes.
It's the next big craze?
Yes.
So what's the latest?
The latest is the founder of a movement to unite Germany's left wing has said that her movement will take to the streets in 2019, inspired by the Gilets jaunes protests in France at the end of last year. Her name is Sarah Wagenknecht, which is definitely the correct pronunciation before you query it. And she is a member of parliament representing the left-wing Die Linke party, and I think it's very interesting. She was speaking to the Foreign Press Association in Berlin and sort of setting out the movement's aims this year.
Okay, but if she's a member of parliament, straight away, there's no comparison, is there, with the Gilets jaunes? I mean, if she's saying, we can do what they've done in Germany.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting, is that the Gilets jaunes was something that was obviously spontaneous
grassroots,
and impulsive and generated by a flash of fury against Macron. And what's interesting about this is that it seems far more premeditated and planned, as if, they achieved their aims to a certain extent, even though their objectives were, far-reaching and desperate and sort of mad.
But can it be a real protest group if you're a parliamentarian?
I don't see why not. She has 170,000 signed up members. I think there's a lot of cross-party influence. It's a lot of the left. I think it is going to be a big movement this year to watch out for.
Do you think so, Holden? Do you think protest is becoming more effective, and even parliamentarians, albeit ones that don't represent political parties, are going to be endorsing street protests as a way of actually affecting change across Europe?
I'm not convinced. I feel that if she had the power to bring thousands of Germans onto the streets, then she probably would do that rather than talking to The Guardian about how she might do this at some point. It seemed a little bit like an attempt to kickstart something that really I'm not convinced. Maybe just that I'm buying too much in stereotypes of French and German workers, but she almost acknowledged that in what she was saying, and that she's saying it's going to take a lot more to get Germans onto the streets than it does to take French people, because they have more of a tradition of this sort of protest. But also I think I'm right in saying that the German economy has just been working a lot better than the French economy has. So I'm not sure that there's enough sense of strife within Germany to create the conditions for this sort of protest.
Well, there's also, Holly, if we're playing with stereotypes of European countries, there's also a lot of order and discipline and structure in Germany in the way that their business, their economy, their parliament works compared to France. It's more analogous with here in the UK, and I guess that's why when we have protests, we see thousands of people on the street, stop the war, the recent pro-EU rally, but nothing happens. It's like acknowledged that's a little vent where you can let out your anger, but that's not real politics. That's not really how things work.
I think that is the same in Germany as well. They've had more than 100,000 people marched in Berlin to protest against the far right in October. They do have protests. It's among the highest in Europe. There's lots of pro and anti-refugee marches, neo-Nazi demonstrations, left-wing May Day marches, but a bit like you say in the UK, it doesn't turn into full protests, although we did have the riots. But I don't know.
Well, the violence is the thing, isn't it? So it's almost like the reason that it's really made a difference in France is the threat of violence. That's what's very often lacking in other countries.
And Wagenknecht, which is the pronunciation I'm going to go for. I may well be just as wrong. She does seem to tread this careful but slightly disingenuous line on the violence. Like in her interview with The Guardian, she said, "I'm clear that we don't want any violence, but at the same time you have to recognise that it is a clear expression of pent-up anger. It doesn't just come out of nowhere." And that does seem a little bit of a way of both trying to disown it, but also to say, it shows how right I am, and it shows how justified the people are in their cause. And, you know, it's a line that if it had been less well expressed, you could imagine Trump saying a similar thing, and he has said similar things about violence from his protesters.
She also seems to tread a line between whether it's mainstream politics or not, and kind of comes across as if this is the new thing that's going to be the change for the people. They can have their voice by not supporting mainstream politics. But she also talks about momentum and whether the changes in the UK after Brexit, that will be based on decision makers, she says. So it does boil down to who's actually in government. And there's momentum, you could say, as a movement, but it is a Labour movement. You have to be a Labour member. It's all about backing Jeremy Corbyn. So as an example of a movement that is an alternative to our democracy, I'm not sure it quite steps up to what she's saying.
I think Brexit is an example where the idea of a movement arising from outside the mainstream parties has more credence. Her attitude to Brexit is interesting too, because she is almost the Jeremy Corbyn line that.
I'd love you to clarify what the Jeremy Corbyn line is.
I will now attempt.
It's taken me 2 years. I have no idea.
She seems to see the EU as a pro-capitalist, pro-business organisation. And she talks a lot about how free movement of capital and free movement of labour have suppressed wages. And so the EU has made life harder for less well-off people. That seems to be her analysis of what caused Brexit. And there's probably some elements of truth to that. I think Brexit's complicated, lots of things led to it. But whatever happens between now and March, we're likely to end up with a majority of people feeling hurt or betrayed, in that we're not going to remain, but there's no form of Brexit that can please all Brexiteers at the same time.
At the moment, we think we're not going to remain. I mean, this conversation might seem archaic by March.
That's my prediction.
But it's true, isn't it, that whatever happens, Listy, there's going to be a lot of angry people. So in that sense, could this conversation feel archaic as well? Like us saying, oh, well, we'd never see protests on the streets in Britain. I mean, is that your point for raising this story, that actually we could, because of what's happening in March and April?
I think so. And I think that for me, the Trump and the Brexit, I think you're seeing a lot of very polarised people digging their heels in, taking very entrenched positions and saying, well, I don't want to talk to you if you've got a different opinion to me. And what I think is interesting about the protests that, didn't just erupt in France. You saw them in Sweden, you saw them in the Netherlands, you've seen them in Belgium. They have sort of taken on, regardless of what happens in Germany this year, you're seeing a lot of people who are sort of transcending these very rigid political party structures and saying, I only identify as Labour or Conservative or Brexit or Remain, and you're seeing them come together over different issues. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's very messy and complex, and there aren't these clear aims, but I do think that is kind of breaking down the very rigid political structures, and I think that is fascinating to watch.
Brexit does seem to paralyse both the main political parties and, oddly, the Lib Dems as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if somebody did step forward from outside the mainstream. My worry is that the person who seems most likely to do that is the one man who has done that in recent history and who is now a free agent again after his latest and strangest resignation. And that's Nigel Farage. I mean, he seems to be positioning himself to come forward again and try to capitalise on whatever sense of betrayal there is, and it feels that there will be that sense, whatever solution we end up with.
But then the issue underneath that is you may have a figurehead at the top, but it's not a united movement of people who want the same thing, is it? That's the thing.
No, but I mean that is what led to Brexit.
Yes.
I feel, and it,
but
maybe
we're talking about Germany, so let's go back to the left wing in Germany. We're not talking about Nigel Farage here. They have a very consensus-based parliament. So even if there is this big left-wing movement, and even if they all do come together and protest on the streets, it's then got to get through a parliament which is always in coalition. So almost inevitably then governs from the centre, right?
But,
that's the centre, right, question mark, not the centre right.
But possibly. I think in some ways, I think this kind of left-wing alliance is a response to the Alternative for Deutschland, which is rising. And the left-wing has been hemorrhaging support to them. So I think in some ways, it is just about forming unity and getting that alliance there in the first place, regardless of then I think what policies get pushed through or what changes get made. It's sort of getting the movement back on track and getting people to even take part in political discourse and even sort of find their voice or whatever and get back involved in the political discussion.
OK, one to watch and one last story to come after this. And so, finally this week, it is Holden. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Here's why 2019 might bring us a deadly blast from the past.
Malaria victims suffer fever, loss of blood, convulsions, brain damage, and coma. Countless millions have been killed by it. Most people who die from the disease are pregnant women and children under the age of 5.
Yep, we thought we'd end with a laugh. So that was the YouTube documentary Malaria Life Cycle Part 1 Human Host by the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. Now, Holden, I know you have some bad news about malaria, but also some good news. But let's start with the bad news, since we have been talking about funerals and protests so far.
This is an unusual story, even by our standards, I think, because there's a general agreement that we're at a turning point, but then really big disagreement about whether things are about to get a lot better or a lot worse. And the news this week has been the bad news, and that's the discovery of a new strain of malaria in Cambodia, which is resistant to all 3 of the main drugs that are used to treat it.
OK, and the good news is what? Everywhere else those 3 drugs are working?
Well, so far, but there is a real worry that the resistance could spread. And
what's the good news?
That
what's
has
the good
happened
news?
once before. The good news is a much bigger and broader sweep of progress over the last 2 decades. So malaria deaths peaked around about the year 2000 at 840,000 or so across the world. In 2017, which is the last year we have figures for, that had fallen to 435,000.
Wow, okay.
So really big changes. And that's at a period where the population in malaria-affected areas has increased dramatically. So actually, if without change, you'd have expected those numbers to grow substantially. There are many reasons for that. Treatment's been better targeted, there's more effective tests, 600 million mosquito nets have been handed out in affected areas, and that's meant that in Kenya and Tanzania, for example, in 1999, less than 3% of children slept under mosquito nets. Now it's around 55%. All of that has reduced the general levels substantially. But that 1999 peak in deaths was caused by the last outbreak of drug-resistant malaria, which also started in Cambodia. In Southeast Asia, malaria is present, but it affects a relatively small number of people, and health systems are better equipped to deal with it. It's once they reach Africa, where it's more prevalent generally and health systems are less effective, that it tends to cause these deaths.
Felicity, are you a malarial optimist or pessimist?
I think it's interesting. I think I was a bit of an optimist because I thought I was seeing a lot of news stories coming through saying that they were making progress and there were breakthroughs happening. But I suppose in some ways that's a kind of double-edged sword, in that I think the problem that you're seeing is that persuading governments to allocate finances to keep countries who already have eradicated it, to keep it that way, and to tackle it in countries where it's still prevalent is really, really hard. So it's actually I think the money has now plateaued, and that's really difficult. And my understanding of malaria is that you can't really ease up the pressure anytime. You've got to keep going, and you've got to keep on finding new drugs that are going to be resistant. And I think because of because of the problems that you're seeing now with the resistance, it's got to be a kind of constant thing, and that's really difficult because it just requires so much funding. And I think there's other problems in terms of climate change and increased migration. So I think Bill Gates has said he's confident that it can be eradicated by 2040, but there's a lot of problems that could get in the way before that happens. So probably a bit negative.
Okay. And Holly, this thing of drug-resistant diseases, do you think that's slightly overplayed in the media? Because it's a sensational story people like to hear. I know that sounds awful, but because it's a bad news story, but it's a story where people feel, oh, there's a new threat. But actually, as Holden was suggesting, maybe it's in the minority of cases.
I don't know. I think it might be one of the most underreported and under-egged points of our time, because the antimicrobial resistance, generally it's antibiotics, not just antimalarials and other things, it could have the greatest consequences. Like you say, you think you've come so far eradicating a disease and then suddenly it comes back full throttle. That would be a negative side for me, but a positive, it seems like quite a collaborative community that's trying to deal with it. Like you say, Bill Gates, a lot of the research is open source, people are trying to work together. It's not kind of big pharmaceuticals that are keeping their closed books on their research. So it sounds like a lot of people are trying to do it for the right reasons, not just making money, but actually trying to solve the problem, because it is one of the biggest diseases, biggest issues and killers.
I saw a newspaper article where someone was quoting the malarial science community as being a very positive community that collaborates with each other in the way you just suggested. And I was kind of reading it and thinking, what scientist doesn't? So what are the diseases where scientists are keeping all the research to themselves to make loads of money and not helping people?
Well, pharmaceuticals would have patents on some drugs so that other people can't make them. Otherwise, they would be out of business, which in a way, they need to have patents so that they can keep going and make money. But
are there widespread killers like malaria whereby people are not collaborating and sharing information?
I think the history of HIV in Africa is a good example of that, actually, where, there has been progress made, but those drugs were so expensive that it essentially priced a whole continent out of them for a good 10 to 15 years. Malaria, I think the drugs are cheaper to start with, which helps. And also there are low-tech solutions like nets and insecticides. I wonder as well, actually, if there hasn't just been some learning from the experience of HIV and perhaps more awareness of PR, to put it bluntly, and the people researching feel that they have to get those new drugs out there as quickly as possible.
Felicity.
There was a really interesting story at the end of last year about dogs. So this is related. Scientists have worked out that dogs are very accurate and good at detecting a range of human diseases. We've known that for a while, but they also can now identify individuals affected with malaria, even if they are not showing symptoms.
What? How?
Yeah, they did it in the Gambia with school children wearing socks. And basically, if you're carrying malaria, the problem with malaria is that you could have it and your symptoms could be really, really mild, like a bit of a fever or something like that.
Delicately put.
If you carry malaria, you will give off a certain odour. And
less delicately put.
And dogs have such a high sense of smell that they've been able to sniff out malaria on these socks, which would be really great if.
But it still doesn't prevent it, does it?
It doesn't prevent it.
That's a good magic trick.
It's a good way of talking about dogs, which I think can just solve up any kind of problem. But it's a good way of being able to reach people a lot earlier. So before someone even is aware that they might have malaria, you can get to them sooner. And I think the problem is the transmission of the disease, isn't it? So if you can quarantine them or get them healthy before they've had a chance to pass it on to someone else, that would be huge. But it's just an example, I suppose, of a kind of good news story that shows that there are things that can be done and there are ways we can tackle it.
There are a lot, and I should say that both the WHO and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation still are committed to eradicating malaria and believe that is, that's not a kind of pie in the sky aspirational aim, that they have a program, and there's 21 countries that have been selected for elimination by not the countries, malaria, been selected for elimination by 2020. Paraguay was declared malaria-free last year, 2018, and 3 other countries, Algeria, China and El Salvador, also reported 0 cases. That will be investigated. They'll be certified if the WHO accepts it. So there is progress being made, and it's being made on many fronts. Detection actually has a role in reducing resistance too, because you can avoid treating people who don't have the disease. And the other new drugs are emerging all the time, which need to be taken for shorter periods of time. That also helps with reducing resistance because people are more likely to complete the course. You don't get kind of partial treatments. It's a really difficult story to report because it does have this element of being overall very positive, but a sense that there's a small but very real potential for all of the gains we've made over the past 20 years to be erased.
And on that happy note, that is it from this New Year's edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Holden Frith, Holly Clements and Felicity Capon. I've been Olly Mann. I will be back with another episode next week. Just make sure to subscribe to this podcast and you'll get it as soon as it drops. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.